There is a rule in the galaxy. You don't pay for someone else's funeral. When the Syndicate came for Earth 30 years ago, the Galactic Council turned their backs. We didn't. We bled for that little blue world, burning a third of our fleet so humanity could survive. Now the Syndicate had come for us. We were alone, watching our skies burn, waiting for the cold end. We thought humanity was still licking its wounds. We were wrong. The sky above Arcadia didn't just burn, it screamed. It was a low, tearing sound, like a sheet of metal being ripped in half by a giant hand. I huddled at the bottom of a trench, cut into the red clay of my homeworld. My knees pulled to my chest. Every time the Syndicate artillery fired from orbit, the ground shuddered, shaking loose a fine layer of dirt that coated my armor, my rifle, and the inside of my mouth. I spat, but the grit remained. It tasted like ash and copper. My name is Percival. It's a translated approximation, of course. When my species integrated with the wider galactic network, we adopted standard identifiers to make commerce and diplomacy easier for the bipedal mammals that made up the majority of the Council. Now, I was going to die with a borrowed name, buried in the soil of a world the Council had abandoned. Percival, I blinked, my secondary eyelids clearing the dust from my corneas. Mason slid down the muddy incline of the trench wall and crouched beside me. His armor was cracked across the chest plate, the composite material jagged and oozing a thin line of our pale blue blood. He didn't seem to notice. "Sector 4 just went dark," Mason said. His voice was a flat, mechanical rasp through his damaged helmet comms. "Command isn't responding. I think the relay tower took a direct hit." I checked my own terminal mounted on my forearm. Dead static. Nothing but the ghost-white hiss of empty airwaves. "Who's left on the line?" I asked. "Us," Mason replied, staring straight ahead at the dirt wall. "Riley's squad is pinned down in the ruins of the water treatment plant. Coal is bleeding out in the bunker. That's it. That's the grand defense of Arcadia." I leaned my head back against the earth. The Syndicate was methodical. They didn't fight with passion or rage. They fought like accountants balancing a ledger. We had resources they wanted, and our population was a statistical anomaly in their path. For 3 weeks, they had systematically dismantled our orbital defenses, hammered our cities into jagged teeth of glass and concrete, and ground our armies into fertilizer. We had transmitted our distress calls on every known frequency. We had invoked the mutual defense pacts. We had begged the Council. The response was a polite, heavily bureaucratized silence. The Syndicate was too wealthy, too expansive. No one was going to risk a trade embargo, let alone a war, for a second-tier agrarian world like Arcadia. No one except the ones who couldn't. 30 years ago, Earth had been in this exact position. The Syndicate had blockaded the Sol system, intent on stripping it to the mantle. The humans were new to the galactic stage, loud, brash, unrefined. The Council hated them. When the blockade tightened, everyone looked away. But my father hadn't looked away. Our fleet had broken formation. We tore through the Syndicate blockade above a blue-green marble, taking horrific casualties. My father's cruiser had been one of the 80 vessels that burned in the high atmosphere of Earth, buying the humans enough time to rally and push the Syndicate out. We saved them, and in doing so, we painted a massive target on our own backs. The humans had survived, but they were broken. Their shipyards were slag. Their economy was shattered. They retreated into their system to rebuild, cutting off almost all contact with the outside galaxy. They had sent a single envoy to Arcadia after the war. The envoy had stood before our elders, bowed deeply, and said nothing but a solemn, tear-stained thank you. Then they vanished behind the veil of the Sol system. Now, the bill for our defiance had come due. The Syndicate had spent 30 years preparing. We were paying the price for Earth's survival, and Earth was nowhere to be found. "Check your mags," I said, breaking the silence. My voice felt hollow, disconnected from my own body. If Sector 4 is gone, the armor columns will be coming through the valley in less than 10 minutes. Mason unclipped his rifle and popped the battery cell. The indicator light flashed a weak, sickly yellow. 12 charges, he muttered. "I've got 1 thermal grenade." "You?" 15, I said. "And my sidearm." It was a joke. We were facing Syndicate mechanized infantry, walking tanks wrapped in energy shields that could shrug off anti-aircraft fire. We were throwing pebbles at an avalanche. A shadow fell over the trench. I looked up. Through the haze of smoke and falling ash, I could see the massive, angular silhouettes of Syndicate troop transports descending through the clouds. They moved with a terrifying grace, silent and smooth, unbothered by gravity or the swirling storms of debris. They were coming to finish the job. "Percival," Mason said quietly. He didn't look at me. He was staring down at his rifle. "Do you think they remember?" I knew who he meant. I swallowed hard, the dry click in my throat loud in my own ears. "The humans, they've been locked in their system for 30 years, Mason. They're still trying to put their own house back together. Even if they heard the distress call, they don't have the ships. They don't have the guns." "But do you think they remember?" He pressed, his voice tight. "It doesn't matter," I said, racking the bolt on my rifle, the harsh metallic clack cutting through his desperation. "They aren't coming. Nobody is coming. We die here, Mason. We die on our feet. For Arcadia." Mason nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else. He just turned to the lip of the trench, rested the barrel of his rifle on a sandbag, and waited for the end of the world. The bombardment stopped. If anything, the silence was worse than the screaming. The sudden absence of noise felt heavy, a physical weight pressing down on my chest. For 3 weeks, the rhythm of my life had been dictated by the pounding of distant artillery and the shrieking descent of plasma strikes. Now, there was just the wind whistling through the jagged ruins of our defensive line. I risked a glance over the sandbags. The valley below was a wasteland of cratered earth and twisted metal. 3 miles out, a wall of dust was moving toward us. It wasn't the wind. It was the Syndicate vanguard. "Movement!" I called out, ducking back down. "Armor! Lots of it! Spread the word down the line." I waited for the echo of my command, the familiar relay of voices shouting down the trench network. But there was nothing. Just the wind. I looked to my left. Mason was completely still, his eyes fixed down his optic sight. I looked to my right. The trench was empty. The bodies of the fallen had been hastily pushed against the back wall to clear walking paths, their pale blue faces covered in brown dust. We were the last ones holding the center. The flanks had either retreated or evaporated. A static burst cracked in my ear. "Percival, this is Riley." The voice was wet, bubbling. "Riley, status," I barked, tapping my earpiece. "Water treatment. It's gone. Syndicate heavy mechs. Walked right over the reinforced concrete like it was cardboard. Cole is dead. The bunker caved in." He coughed, a terrible rattling sound. "I'm pinned under a support beam. Can't feel my legs." I squeezed my eyes shut. "Hold on, Riley. Play dead. If they sweep the area, maybe they'll bypass the rubble. They don't bypass, Percival. You know that. They're scanning for vitals. I can hear the drones." A long pause. The sound of heavy, rhythmic thudding echoed through the comms. Footsteps. Massive ones. I just wanted to say, "It was an honor, sir." "Riley, don't." The comms cut out with a sharp hiss. I stared at the dirt wall. Riley was 20 standard cycles old, barely an adult. He had planned to study deep space agrostology. Now he was a smear under a syndicate boot. "They're in range," Mason said evenly. I forced myself up to the firing step. The dust cloud had resolved into distinct shapes. Syndicate striders, four-legged monstrosities towering 40 feet in the air, armed with rotary plasma cannons. Beneath them, lines of mechanized infantry advanced in perfect, terrifying synchronization. Silver and black armor, faceless visors, moving with the cold efficiency of an algorithm. They weren't even running. They were walking. They knew we were broken. "Target the infantry," I said, my voice eerily calm. Adrenaline had burned itself out days ago. All that was left was a cold, clear void. "Save the thermal grenade for when they breach." Mason didn't answer. He just pulled the trigger. A bright yellow pulse of energy lanced out from his rifle, striking the chest plate of a syndicate soldier. The shield flared a brilliant purple, absorbing the impact entirely. The soldier didn't even break stride. It raised its own weapon. A bolt of blue plasma the size of my fist slammed into the sandbags inches from Mason's face. The heat washed over me, singing my eyebrows and instantly evaporating the sweat on my skin. The sandbags turned to glass and slag, exploding inward. Mason was thrown backward, landing hard in the mud. He groaned, rolling over. "Suppressive fire!" I yelled, blind firing over the lip of the trench. I pulled the trigger until the rifle clicked empty. I slammed my final battery cell into the receiver. 15 shots left. The ground began to vibrate. The striders were getting closer. Their heavy cannons began to fire, tearing chunks out of the ridge behind us. Dirt and rocks rained down. I hunched my shoulders, keeping my rifle tucked tight. "Percival!" I looked down. Mason was sitting up, but his hands were clutching his abdomen. Smoke was rising from a massive, cauterized hole in his armor. The plasma had burned clean through the composite plating and into his gut. I dropped to my knees beside him. No, hold still." I reached for my med kit, my hands shaking violently. Mason reached out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Don't waste the foam," he coughed. Pale blue blood dribbled from the corner of his mouth. It burned right through. "Shut up, you're fine," I lied, tearing the med kit open. "Percival, look at me," Mason said. His secondary eyelids were fluttering, failing to clear the dust from his eyes. "We held the line." "Tell me we held the line." "We held it," I whispered, pressing a patch of biofoam into the wound. The foam expanded, filling the cavity. But Mason was already staring past me, up at the smoke-choked sky. "The stars are gone," he murmured. His grip on my wrist went slack. His head lolled to the side. I knelt there for a moment, the sound of the approaching syndicate army fading into white noise. My squad was dead. My friends were dead. My world was dying. I slowly reached down and unclipped the thermal grenade from Mason's belt. I hooked it onto my own. I picked up my rifle. I had 15 shots. I stood up. The syndicate infantry was less than 50 yards away. I could see the reflection of the burning city in their polished visors. They were raising their weapons. I didn't aim. I just held the trigger down, screaming at the top of my lungs, pouring my grief and rage into the dirt and the smoke. My rifle clicked empty. I threw it aside and drew my trench knife, a heavy, jagged piece of tungsten steel. I braced my feet in the mud. I waited for the plasma to take me, But the plasma didn't come. Instead, the sky broke. It started as a low rumble, entirely different from the Syndicate artillery. It wasn't the clean, humming vibration of plasma drives or the sterile whine of energy weapons. It was a guttural, roaring vibration that shook the teeth in my skull. It sounded like a mountain tearing itself apart. I looked up. The thick blanket of grey ash covering Arcadia's atmosphere was suddenly punctured by 100 streaks of fire. They weren't elegant ships. They looked like iron bricks, glowing cherry red with re-entry heat, plummeting toward the Earth at suicidal speeds. The Syndicate infantry paused. Their perfect synchronization stuttered. The Striders stopped firing, their heavy turrets swiveling upward to track the incoming anomalies. The sky above us turned into a tempest of fire and thunder. The first object struck the Earth a quarter-mile behind the Syndicate lines. The impact was cataclysmic. A shockwave of displaced air and pulverized dirt rolled over the battlefield, knocking me off my feet. I crashed into the trench wall, gasping for breath. Before I could recover, a dozen more objects slammed into the valley. Boom! 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 The Earth convulsed. I scrambled back to the firing step, coughing through the dust. The Syndicate vanguard was in disarray. The perfectly aligned ranks were scattered, soldiers struggling to stay on their feet amid the localized earthquakes. Where the objects had landed, massive craters now scarred the valley floor. In the center of each crater sat a heavily scorched, angular pod made of raw, unpainted metal. Thick steam hissed from pressure valves. There were no energy shields, no elegant anti-gravity dampeners. They had literally dropped massive chunks of iron from orbit and used the ground to break their fall. It was crude. It was insane. It was human. The sight of the nearest pod blew outward with a violent, explosive crack. The heavy metal door slammed into a nearby Syndicate soldier, crushing him instantly. From the smoke of the pod, a figure emerged. It was a biped, clad in thick, bulky armor that looked more like industrial mining equipment than military gear. It was scratched, dented, and painted a flat, non-reflective olive drab. The helmet was a solid dome with a narrow, glowing red slit for a visor. The figure stepped out of the crater. In its hands, it held a weapon that looked like a pipe welded to a steel box. A Syndicate Strider pivoted its main cannon toward the figure. The Strider fired, a massive ball of plasma shrieking across the distance. The human didn't dive for cover. It didn't deploy a shield. It simply raised a heavy launcher onto its shoulder and pulled the trigger. The backblast kicked up a massive cloud of dust. A physical projectile, a solid, rocket-propelled cone of depleted uranium, screamed across the battlefield, leaving a trail of gray smoke. The Syndicate's energy shields were designed to absorb energy weapons, lasers, plasma, ion blasts. They worked by diffusing heat and light. They were not designed to stop 200 pounds of solid metal moving at Mach 4. The rocket punched clean through the purple energy shield without even slowing down. It struck the Strider squarely in the center chassis. The kinetic transfer was absolute. The armored walking tank was literally lifted off its feet, its metallic frame crumpling inward before detonating in a massive fireball of secondary explosions. Shredded shrapnel rained down on the Syndicate infantry below. I stared, my mouth hanging open. Across the valley, the other pods were opening. Hundreds of humans poured out into the chaos. They didn't form lines. They didn't move in synchronized ranks. They moved like a pack of starving wolves, aggressive, chaotic, and unimaginably fast. The air filled with the deafening, percussive roar of kinetic weaponry. No elegant hums, just the savage bang, bang, bang of chemical explosives driving lead and steel through the air. The Syndicate soldiers, accustomed to returning fire from behind impenetrable energy shields, were slaughtered. Human armor-piercing rounds shattered their composite plating, tearing through circuitry and flesh alike. It was a slaughter. A brutal, primitive, glorious slaughter. I watched as a syndicate soldier charged a human, aiming a plasma rifle. The human simply ducked the shot, closed the distance in 2 massive strides, and slammed a heavy, metal-gauntleted fist into the syndicate soldier's faceplate. The visor shattered. The human grabbed the soldier by the chest piece, lifted him off the ground, and hurled him into the dirt before putting a heavy boot through his chest. They fought with a feral intensity that defied logic. They weren't fighting a war. They were exacting revenge. Suddenly, a shadow eclipsed the sun. I looked up. The clouds parted as something massive broke through the atmosphere. It was a ship, but unlike anything I had ever seen. It was a brutalist wedge of dark grey steel, covered in jagged antennas, massive gun batteries, and scorch marks. It didn't glide. It hovered on a column of raw, uncontained thrust, the roar of its engines drowning out the battle below. On the broad side of the hull, painted in massive, peeling white letters, was the name UNS Vengeance. From the belly of the ship, smaller dropships swarmed out like angry hornets, screaming toward the surface, laying down thick lines of incendiary fire that cooked the remaining syndicate forces in their armor. A heavy thud shook the ground near my trench. I spun around, raising my trench knife. A human had landed on the lip of the trench. He towered over me, a behemoth of olive-drab armor. He looked down at the trench. He looked at Mason's body. Then he looked at me. Slowly the human reached up and pressed a release valve on his helmet. With a hiss of pressurized air, the helmet unsealed and he lifted it off. He was older. His face was scarred, the skin a weathered brown, mapped with deep lines of stress and age. His hair was grey, cropped close to his scalp. He had eyes that looked like they had seen the end of the universe and didn't care for it much. He looked at my uniform. He looked at the pale blue blood on my hands. "Arcadian?" he asked. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone, translated perfectly through the external speaker on his chest plate. I nodded slowly, lowering the knife. I am Percival, commander of the 104th. The human stepped down into the trench. The ground shook slightly under his weight. He looked at the bodies of my squad. He removed a thick, armored glove and extended his bare hand toward me. "Captain Jace, United Nations Marine Corps." He gripped my hand with startling gentleness, pulling me slightly forward. His eyes locked onto mine, burning with a fierce, terrifying warmth. "Sorry we're late, Percival," Jace said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "Traffic was a bitch. We got your call." You came," I stammered, the reality of the moment finally breaking through the shock. "Your system was sealed. The Council said you were dead. You don't have the fleet." Jace let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh. He looked up at the massive ship hovering above us, raining fire onto the syndicate lines. "They were right. We didn't have a fleet," Jace said, his smile turning feral. "So for 30 years we built one. We dug into the core of our dead rocks. We ripped the steel from our own ruined cities. And we built a fleet designed for one thing, and one thing only." He looked back at me, releasing my hand. He reached over and gently closed Mason's eyelids. "We built a fleet to kill the bastards who tried to burn our home," Jace said, picking up his helmet. He slammed it back onto his head, the red visor snapping to life. "And to pay our debts." He turned toward the edge of the trench, racking the bolt on his heavy kinetic rifle. The sound was deafening. "Stay here, Percival," Jace said, vaulting out of the trench with impossible agility. "We'll take the watch." I sat in the mud, clutching my empty rifle. and for the first time in 3 weeks, I wept. I wept for Mason, for Riley, for my father, and I watched as the humans, the loud, brash, unrefined apes from a broken world, tore the invincible Syndicate army into burning shreds. The debt was being paid in blood and iron, and humanity brought a lot of iron. The smell of human warfare was not clean. When the Syndicate fought, the air smelled of ozone, sterilized dust, and flash-melted polymers. It was the scent of a laboratory experiment gone violently wrong. The humans brought a different stench to Arcadia. They smelled of sulfur, burning diesel oil, and atomized blood. It was a suffocating, primal odor that clawed at the back of the throat. It smelled like the earth itself was bleeding. I stood on the lip of my trench, the wind whipping my dust-caked uniform, and watched the avalanche roll forward. Captain Jace had told me to stay put. He had told me they would take the watch. But as I looked down into the muddy ditch at Mason's body, the quiet stillness of the grave felt unbearable. The Syndicate had taken everything from me. They had ground my squad into the dirt, leveled my city, and reduced my homeworld to an ash heap. I was not going to sit in a hole and let someone else finish my war. I checked my sidearm. A plasma pistol. Standard Arcadian officer issue. It had 3 charges left. I holstered it, stepped over the sandbags, and walked into the chaos. The battlefield was unrecognizable. The neat, methodical lines of the Syndicate advance had been churned into a massive, smoking graveyard of shattered metal and cratered earth. Human drop pods littered the valley like the seeds of some terrible iron forest. From them poured an endless stream of olive-drab infantry, moving with a chaotic, terrifying purpose. I fell in behind a squad of humans pushing up the left flank. They didn't notice me at first. They were too busy doing the ugly work of close-quarters extermination. The Syndicate soldiers were trying to adapt. Realizing their energy shields were completely transparent to solid lead and depleted uranium, they had abandoned their synchronized marching formations and sought cover behind the wrecks of their own striders. It didn't matter. The humans simply destroyed the cover. I watched a human soldier, a massive individual with the name Miller, stenciled in chipped white paint on his shoulder pauldron, heft a shoulder-mounted tube. He didn't aim at the Syndicate troops pinned behind a slab of concrete. He aimed at the concrete itself. A thunderous crack echoed across the plain, followed by a concussive shockwave that rattled my teeth. The concrete slab didn't just break, it pulverized into deadly shrapnel, shredding the infantry behind it. They fought with an absolute absence of elegance. There were no calculated flanking maneuvers or strategic retreats to preserve shielding. If a human was pinned down, 2 more would simply charge the firing position, screaming obscenities over the roar of their weapons, willing to trade their own armor, plating for a kill. "Hey, Blue Boy!" I jumped, turning toward the voice. A human was crouched behind the burning chassis of a Syndicate transport, waving me over. I scrambled across the mud, sliding into the dirt beside her. She dragged a heavy, belt-fed, kinetic machine gun onto the hood of the wreck. Her helmet visor was up, revealing a face streaked with soot and sweat. "Sergeant Jenkins!" she shouted over the deafening staccato of her own weapon as she laid down suppressive fire. "What the hell are you doing out of your hole, Arcadian?" "My name is Percival," I yelled back, coughing on the thick smoke rolling off the transport. "And this is my planet." Jenkins stopped firing for a fraction of a second to look at me. She barked a laugh, slapping a new box of ammunition into her weapons feed tray. "Fair enough, Percival. But you're walking into a meat grinder with a pop gun." She reached down to her tactical harness, unclipped a heavy, blocky pistol, and shoved it into my chest. I caught it awkwardly. It weighed as much as my standard issue rifle. "M60 Magnum," Jenkins said, racking the slide of her machine gun, fires half-inch explosive slugs, kicks like a pissed-off mule, aim for the center of mass and hold on to your wrists. I looked down at the weapon. It was hideous. Cold, stamped steel with a grip wrapped in abrasive friction tape. There were no sleek lines, no battery indicators, no targeting reticles. It was just a pipe designed to violently expel metal. I loved it instantly. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me yet," Jenkins grunted, leaning back into her weapon. "The Syndicate just figured out we brought a knife to a gunfight. They're bringing out the big toys." The ground shuddered. It wasn't the impact of a drop pod. It was a rhythmic, seismic pounding that seemed to originate from the heart of the Syndicate backline. Through the haze of grey smoke and falling ash, a silhouette began to take shape. It was massive, easily 100 feet tall. It didn't walk on 4 legs like the Vanguard striders. It rolled forward on massive, segmented tank treads that crushed entire drop pods flat. The upper chassis was a heavily armored citadel, bristling with heavy plasma batteries and missile racks. "Siege engine," I whispered, the cold void in my chest suddenly filling with ice. They brought a planet cracker. The machine paused. From its center, a massive, singular lens began to glow with a blinding violet light. "Incoming!" Jenkins screamed, grabbing my shoulder and hauling me down into the mud. The air pressure dropped instantly, sucking the breath from my lungs. A beam of concentrated thermal energy, thicker than a human dreadnought, slammed into the earth 100 yards to our right. The impact didn't explode. It simply unmade the world. A massive trench of boiling lava was carved into the valley floor in an instant. 3 human squads caught in the beam's path didn't even have time to scream. They simply evaporated into ghosts of ash. The massive machine swept the beam in a slow, agonizing arc, cutting the human advance in half. The heat washed over our cover, blistering the paint on the transport and forcing my secondary eyelids to snap shut. "Command, this is Jenkins!" she roared into her helmet comms. "We have a Class A heavy armor unit on the field. We need orbital bombardment right damn now." Static crackled in response. Then, the gravelly voice of Captain Jace cut through. "Negative, Jenkins. The Vengeance is taking heavy fire from a Syndicate orbital platform. We're losing the sky. Air support is grounded. You need to crack that thing from the dirt." Jenkins cursed, a long, creative string of human profanity, and slammed her fist against the transport. Armor-piercing rounds are bouncing off its physical plating. The shield is down, but its hull is too thick for small arms. We need a satchel charge in its main thermal exhaust, or that thing is going to melt this entire valley to glass. I looked at the towering monstrosity. It was systematically erasing the human foothold, forcing the surviving Marines to scramble for the meager cover of smoking craters. I looked down at the heavy pistol in my hands. Then I looked at the scorched earth beneath my boots. "Jenkins," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "I know how to get under it." Jenkins stared at me, her dark eyes narrowing. "Under it? It's a rolling fortress, Percival. Anything that gets within 50 yards gets turned into a cinder. Not if we go beneath the surface." I pointed toward a cluster of ruined concrete pillars jutting out of the earth a few 100 feet away. This valley used to be the primary agricultural hub for the capital. Beneath this topsoil is a massive network of hydro-transit tunnels. They move water and fertilizer from the reservoir to the fields. I quickly drew a crude map in the mud with the barrel of the Magnum. The main conduit runs directly beneath the valley floor, straight toward the Syndicate backline. If that siege engine is advancing on a linear path to maximize its beam sweep, it will roll right over Sector 7G of the tunnel network. Jenkins studied the dirt map, her jaw tight. "Are the tunnels intact?" "They're heavily reinforced concrete," I said. "They might be collapsed in places, but they'll hold long enough to bypass the kill zone. Jenkins tapped her comms. Miller, get your demo kit and get your ass over to my position. Bring 3 more. We're going underground. Within minutes, Miller, the massive marine I had seen earlier, slid into our crater, followed by 3 others. They looked like walking armories, strapped with bandoliers of heavy explosives, magnetic mines, and shaped charges. What's the play, Sarge? Miller asked, his voice a deep rumble beneath his helmet. The Arcadian is taking us on a subterranean tour, Jenkins said, pointing to the concrete pillars. We get under that rolling toaster, blow the street out from beneath it, and shove a bundle of C-12 up its exhaust vent when it drops into the hole. Miller looked at me, tilting his head. Lead the way, Blue Boy. We moved in a staggered sprint, diving from crater to crater, while the siege engine continued to carve the valley into a lake of fire. We reached the pillars just as a barrage of syndicate plasma fire melted the ground we had been standing on seconds before. I found the heavy steel maintenance hatch half buried in the rubble. It was buckled and warped from the artillery strikes. Miller didn't wait for a command. He stepped forward, wedged a heavy crowbar into the seal, and heaved. The muscles in his neck strained against the collar of his armor until, with a screech of tearing metal, the hatch popped open. A wave of cool, damp, foul-smelling air washed over us. Into the dark, Marines, Jenkins ordered. I dropped down the rusted ladder first, clicking on the tactical light mounted to my shoulder guard. The tunnel was wide enough to drive a transport through, lined with massive pipes that hummed with a faint, dying pulse of the city's automated systems. The ground was slick with mud and stagnant water. The humans dropped in behind me, the heavy thud, thud, thud of their boots echoing ominously in the enclosed space. It's a straight shot for a mile, I whispered, though there was no one to hear us down here. But we have to move fast. The structure is compromised. Above us, the earth groaned. The vibrations from the battle on the surface sent constant cascades of dust and concrete flakes raining down on our helmets. Every time the siege engine fired its main weapon, the tunnel walls flexed inward, the reinforced rebar groaning in agony. We ran through knee-deep sludge, vaulting over collapsed support beams and squeezing through narrow gaps where the ceiling had caved in. I led the way, navigating the labyrinth of maintenance junctions by memory. This was my home. I knew its bones. "Hold up!" Jenkins hissed abruptly, throwing a fist in the air. We froze. Above us, the rhythmic pounding of the artillery had vanished, replaced by a deep, mechanical grinding that shook the stagnant water at our feet into a frenzy of ripples. It sounded like an earthquake, dragging itself across the ceiling. "It's right above us," Miller whispered, looking up at the cracked concrete. "It's settling into a firing position." Jenkins looked at me. "Are we at Sector 7G? I checked the faded stencil on the wall beside me. SEC 7G, maint. We're right in the center of the span." "Miller, rig the ceiling," Jenkins ordered. "Take the support pillars out. We drop the floor out from under this bitch, pin its treads in the crater, and hit the vents when the undercarriage is exposed." The Marines moved with terrifying efficiency. They didn't speak. They communicated in sharp hand gestures, slapping bricks of grey explosive onto the load-bearing pillars of the tunnel, linking them with detonator cord. Suddenly, a massive chunk of the ceiling gave way. A slab of concrete the size of a transport crushed one of the Marines instantly. Sunlight poured in through the hole, along with a massive, segmented steel tread that ground into the tunnel floor. The siege engine's weight was already collapsing the tunnel. "Fire in the hole!" Miller roared, grabbing the detonator and diving backward. The blast was deafening. The explosive severed the support pillars, and the entire structural integrity of the tunnel vanished. The world above us simply fell in, I was thrown violently into the mud by the shockwave, my ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. The tunnel was suddenly flooded with blinding daylight and choking dust. I scrambled backward, coughing up dirty water. When the dust cleared, the sight was staggering. The massive siege engine had plunged into the sinkhole we created. Its left treads were buried in the rubble, canting the entire machine at a 45-degree angle. Its main cannon fired wildly into the sky, the violet beam harmlessly searing the clouds. But it wasn't dead. The undercarriage of the machine was exposed, revealing a massive, glowing orange exhaust port roughly 10 feet in diameter. It was venting superheated gas, screaming like a dying animal. "Miller, the charge!" Jenkins yelled, firing her machine gun up into the undercarriage to suppress the automated defense turrets attempting to track us. Miller scrambled up the mountain of rubble, hauling a heavy canvas satchel. He was 50 feet from the vent when a Syndicate plasma turret locked onto him. A bolt of blue fire struck him in the shoulder, blowing his left arm clean off at the joint. Miller screamed, tumbling backward down the debris pile, dropping the satchel charge. It rolled down the concrete slab, coming to rest a few feet from me. "Miller!" Jenkins screamed, breaking cover to run toward him, but the defense turrets pinned her down behind a twisted I-beam. The remaining Marine was dead, crushed by falling debris. The siege engine's main cannon began to lower. It was trying to aim down into the hole. If it fired, we would all be incinerated instantly. I looked at Miller, bleeding out in the mud. I looked at the satchel charge. Arcadians are not built for war. We are farmers, engineers, and scholars. Our bones are lighter. Our muscle mass is lower. But humans aren't the only ones who know how to pay a debt. I dropped the magnum, grabbed the heavy canvas satchel, and ran. "Percival, no!" Jenkins yelled. I ignored her. I scrambled up the slick, jagged mountain of concrete and rebar. The heat from the exhaust vent washed over me, singing my uniform and burning my exposed skin. I could feel my lungs blistering with every breath. A plasma bolt clipped my thigh, sending a jolt of agonizing pain up my spine. My blue blood spattered against the grey concrete. I stumbled, but I didn't stop. I used my uninjured leg to push off a piece of rebar, launching myself toward the glowing orange maw of the exhaust vent. I slammed the satchel charge against the magnetic grating of the vent, twisting the timer dial to 0. I didn't have time to jump clear. I simply let go and fell backward. The explosion didn't just rattle my teeth, it broke the sky. The C-12 charge detonated inside the thermal exhaust of the siege engine, creating a localized pressure vacuum that ignited the machine's internal plasma reserves. The blast wave caught me mid-air, throwing me like a rag doll against the far wall of the collapsed tunnel. I hit the mud hard, my vision fracturing into jagged shards of white and black. The siege engine tore itself apart from the inside out. A geyser of blue fire and shattered armor erupted into the atmosphere, a brilliant, beautiful pillar of destruction. The immense machine groaned, buckled, and collapsed into the crater, a dead, smoldering husk of iron and melted wire. I lay in the mud, unable to move my legs, staring up at the smoke clearing through the hole in the ceiling. Heavy footsteps crunched over the debris. A shadow fell over me. Captain Jace stood at the edge of the crater, his armor scorched black, his red visor glowing in the dim light. He looked down at the ruined siege engine, then down at Jenkins, who was hauling a heavily bandaged Miller over her shoulder. Finally, Jace looked at me. He slid down the rubble pile, kneeling beside me in the mud. He unsealed his helmet, tossing it aside. His face was covered in dirt and blood, but his eyes were bright. He reached down, grabbing the collar of my tactical vest, and hauled me up into a sitting position. The pain was blinding, but I forced myself to look him in the eye. "You hit the vent," Jace stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. I hit the vent, I wheezed, coughing up a spatter of blue blood. Jace looked at the crater, then back at me. A slow, terrifying grin spread across his scarred face. He clapped a massive, heavy hand onto my uninjured shoulder, a gesture so forceful it nearly knocked me back down. "Good man, Percival," Jace said, his voice carrying the weight of an entire species' respect. "Good damn man, now get up. We still have a planet to take back." Human combat medicine was not designed to heal. It was designed to keep a body functional long enough to finish the job. Griggs, a wiry medic with a splatter shield bolted over his face, slid down the crater wall. He didn't offer a gentle touch or a soothing word. He took one look at my plasma-burned thigh, pulled a heavy pneumatic stapler from his harness, and jammed the cold steel nose directly into the wound. "Bite down, Blue," he grunted. He pulled the trigger before I could brace myself. Thick steel staples bit deep into my flesh, forcibly dragging the cauterized edges together with a sickening crunch. I screamed, my vision whiting out. Griggs ignored me. He uncapped a pressurized cylinder with his teeth and sprayed a thick, caustic foam over the jagged metal line. It burned like acid, smelling sharply of ammonia and copper, but the agonizing throb instantly dulled to a cold, heavy numbness. "Can you walk?" Captain Jace asked. He was already turned away, scanning the smoke. I tested the leg. It felt like a dead log strapped to my hip, but it held my weight. I nodded, gripping what the heavy Magnum Jenkins had given me. "Good," Jace said, racking the bolt on his rifle. "We aren't done." The destruction of the siege engine had shattered the Syndicate's spine. The battlefield rhythm shifted from an organized defense to a panicked rout. The surviving mechanized infantry were falling back, retreating toward a massive, prefabricated command bunker entrenched at the far end of the valley. Jace didn't order a charge. He didn't rally his troops with a speech or a war cry. He simply stepped out of the crater and started walking. The rest of the human marines followed. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. Hundreds of heavily armored soldiers, battered, bleeding and caked in grey ash, advancing through the mud with a slow, inevitable cadence. They abandoned the concept of cover. When a Syndicate soldier popped up from behind a ruined transport to lay down suppressing fire, a dozen kinetic weapons swung toward the target in eerie unison. The suppressing fire was met with a localized storm of lead and depleted uranium, tearing both the cover and the soldier into absolute ruin. The air grew thick with the choking stench of cordite, burning diesel, and atomized blood. I limped alongside Jace, the Magnum heavy and reassuring in my grip. I fired it once at a fleeing Syndicate straggler who had lost his energy shield. The recoil sent a shockwave up my arm, nearly dislocating my shoulder. But the explosive slug caught the soldier in the center of his chest. He went down in a spray of purple and didn't get back up. We reached the perimeter of the Syndicate command bunker. It was a massive, dome-like structure of sleek, black composite material, built to withstand orbital bombardment. It sat like a sterile, arrogant blister on the ruined face of my homeworld. The heavy blast doors were sealed tight. "Breach it," Jace ordered, his voice flat. 4 Marines jogged forward, carrying heavy magnetic cutting charges. They slapped the grey putty onto the interlocking seams of the blast doors, set the timers, and jogged back. Fire in the hole. The explosion was a focused, inward-directed crack that sucked the air from my lungs. The locking mechanisms shattered. Before the smoke could even begin to clear, Jace stepped up and kicked the heavy left door inward with an armored boot. We poured into the bunker. The interior was a jarring contrast to the mud and slaughter outside. Blindingly bright, sterile white lights reflected off polished floors and pristine control consoles. The air was temperature-controlled, smelling faintly of ozone and recycled oxygen. And it was full of panicked syndicate officers. These weren't the faceless infantry. These were the architects of my world's destruction. They wore immaculate, silver-threaded uniforms, their tall, slender frames huddled frantically behind holographic tactical tables. A few heavy security guards tried to raise their plasma rifles. They were met with the deafening roar of human combat shotguns. In the enclosed, pristine space, the kinetic weapons were apocalyptic. The guards were literally blown off their feet, their shields shattering under the raw physical mass of buckshot and solid slugs. The flawless white walls were instantly painted with broad, wet streaks of vivid purple. The Marines spread out, clearing the room in seconds. No shouting, no hesitation, just the mechanical, rhythmic pull of triggers until nothing was left standing. "Clear left," Jenkins yelled. "Clear right," Griggs echoed. Jace walked slowly toward the center of the room. Behind the main tactical table, cowering on the polished floor, was the Syndicate Overseer. He was a high-ranking aristocrat, his chest weighed down by medals from a dozen subjugated worlds. He was trembling violently, his 4 eyes wide with absolute terror as he stared up at the blood-soaked, mud-caked human looming over him. "Stop!" the Overseer shrieked, raising his long, elegant hands. "I invoke the Geneva Conventions. I invoke the Galactic Council Treaties of Armed Conflict. We surrender." Jace stopped. He looked down at the Overseer, his scarred face completely devoid of emotion. "The Geneva Conventions," Jace repeated, his voice a low, rough rumble. "Yes," the Overseer babbled, scrambling backward until his spine hit a console. "You are humans. You must accept our surrender. It is the law." Jace slowly reached up. With a thick, armored finger, he wiped a streak of pale blue Arcadian blood off his own chest plate. He stared at it for a long moment. "The Geneva Conventions were burned 30 years ago," Jace said quietly. "Along with Paris, and Tokyo, and New York." The Overseer stared at him, uncomprehending, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "But the Council laws—" "The Council isn't here," Jace interrupted. He raised his heavy kinetic rifle, the bruised and smoking barrel aimed squarely at the Overseer's chest. "And we didn't come here to arrest you. We came here to kill you." He pulled the trigger. The gunshot was a physical blow in the enclosed space. The Overseer slumped backward, sliding down the console, leaving a wide, glistening smear of purple across the white polymer. Jace lowered his rifle. He didn't spare the body a second glance. He turned to Jenkins. "Upload a localized virus into their comms network," Jace ordered. "Blind their orbital sensors. Tell the fleet the surface command is broken." I stood near the shattered blast doors, leaning heavily against the cold metal frame. My leg throbbed with a dull, rhythmic agony, but I couldn't feel it. I was staring at the dead Overseer. For 3 weeks, that creature had ordered the systematic slaughter of my species with the casual indifference of a banker balancing a ledger. And a human from a dead world had just ended him with a single piece of lead. By the time we walked back out of the bunker, the sky had changed. The thick, grey ash clouds that had choked Arcadia for weeks were breaking apart, chased away by the atmospheric displacement of 100 massive ships descending through the stratosphere. I limped to the edge of the perimeter and looked up. The human fleet had arrived. They weren't elegant. They didn't have the sweeping, aerodynamic curves of council cruisers or the glowing, crystalline spires of syndicate dreadnoughts. They were flying cinder blocks, massive, brutalist wedges of dark grey steel, covered in heavy armor plating and bristling with macro cannons. They blotted out the sun, casting long, hard shadows over the ruined valley. Smaller dropships were swarming down like locusts, landing in the mud, to deploy heavy engineering vehicles, field hospitals, and thousands more Marines. The Syndicate forces in orbit had been completely wiped out. The Vengeance hung low in the sky, its hull scorched and smoking, but defiant. The battle for Arcadia was over. I felt my knees buckle. The adrenaline that had sustained me for the last 4 hours suddenly evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. I slid down the side of a ruined transport, sitting heavily in the dirt. Footsteps approached, heavy, rhythmic, human footsteps. Captain Jace stopped beside me. He unclipped a metal canteen from his belt and tossed it to me. I caught it clumsily. "Drink," he said. "It tastes like tin, but it's clean." I unscrewed the cap and drank. It was cold water. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. I poured a little over my hands, washing away the thickest layers of dried blood and mud. Jace crouched down beside me, resting his forearms on his knees. He looked out over the valley. "They're sweeping the cities," Jace said quietly. "The Syndicate ground forces are surrendering en masse. We're rounding them up. We'll load them onto their own transports and send them back to their core worlds with a message." I looked at him. "What message?" Jace turned his head, his dark eyes meeting mine. "That the quarantine is lifted, that humanity is back, and that if they ever touch this world again, we won't stop at their military targets." I swallowed hard. "The Council won't like that. They'll sanction you. They might even try to blockade you again." Jace let out a short, harsh laugh. "Let them try. We spent 30 years turning our solar system into a fortress. We hollowed out our moons to build shipyards. We strip-mined the asteroid belt to build those dreadnoughts. They want to blockade us? They better bring a bigger navy." He looked back at the sky, watching a massive heavy lifter lower a prefab hospital module to the surface. "Your father," Jace said suddenly. The shift in topic caught me off guard. "He was a cruiser captain, right? During the blockade of Seoul?" I stared at him, stunned. How do you know that?" "I read the casualty reports from the defense of Earth," Jace said softly. 80 Arcadian vessels broke formation to save us. One of them was the Spear of Dawn. Captained by a male named Tyrus, he held the line over the North American eastern seaboard long enough for our civilian transports to evacuate the blast zone. I was on one of those transports. I was 8 years old. "I know," Jace said. "We kept the records. We memorized the names of every Arcadian ship, every captain, every crew member who died for us. We carved their names into a massive slab of black granite in the center of what used to be Geneva. Every human child is taught what you did." He squeezed my shoulder, a gesture of profound, unspoken grief and gratitude. "We didn't forget you, Percival," Jace said, his voice thick with emotion. "When we heard the Syndicate was moving on Arcadia, we didn't vote on it. We didn't debate it in a Senate. We just loaded the guns and lit the engines." I looked at the human captain. I looked at the scars on his face, the gray in his hair, the absolute, unyielding iron in his posture. They had suffered so much. They had been pushed to the very brink of extinction, forced to rebuild their society in the ashes of a global graveyard. And yet, their first act upon returning to the stars was not conquest. It was not expansion. It was to pay a debt. "You saved us," I whispered, the tears finally breaking through, cutting clean tracks through the dirt on my face. Jace stood up. He looked out at his Marines, at his ships, at the blood-soaked mud of my world. He picked up his helmet and tucked it under his arm. "No, Percival," Jace said, his voice carrying the quiet, absolute certainty of a species that had looked into the abyss and learned how to bite back. You saved us. We just came to balance the ledger." He turned and began walking back toward his squad, a lone figure of olive drab fading into the bustling chaos of the human landing zone. I sat against the ruined transport, watching the setting sun catch the dark steel of the human dreadnoughts above. The sky was no longer screaming. The earth was no longer shaking. My squad was gone. My world was scarred. But as I watched the apes from a broken planet establish a perimeter around my ruined home, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. We would never be alone again. If you felt the weight of that ending and the iron-clad loyalty of Captain Jace, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We forge epic, original HFY Sci-Fi stories just like this every single week, bringing you the most badass tales of humanity, balancing the ledger across the stars. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves gritty, action-packed science fiction. Drop a comment below. If you were commanding a human dreadnought to save Arcadia, what would you name your ship? Ring that notification bell, stand with Earth, and we'll see you in the next story.